Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first half of the subglacial environments, processes, and life form session. I'm screen sharing today's schedule, so we'll get started right away with the newly minted Dr. Gustafson talking about salty groundwater in sedimentary basins beneath Willand's ice plain. Before we start, I want to encourage everyone to utilize the chat function and go ahead and ask questions in there. If we don't have time for them between talks, we can save them to the discussion period at the end.
Okay, I will share my screen now. Okay, and just a head nod that I have only one slide showing. Yes. Okay, I'll start my timer so I can stick to 8 minutes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Like Ryan said, I'm Chloe, and today I'll be talking about research that I've done for my PhD and continue to work on, which is imaging salty groundwater in sedimentary basins beneath Willand's ice plain, West Antarctica. And this is work that I've done with my awesome collaborators, Carrie Key, Matt Siegfried, and Helen Fricker. So just to start off, this is how we typically think of subglacial hydrology. So we have our ice sitting on top of sediment or a till layer, and water can either exist in the form of these channels, either within the ice or the sediment, or we might have porous flow through the till layer. But today I'd really like to pose the question, do we actually have water extending deeper than the till layer in deeper groundwater reservoirs? So a good place to look for these deep groundwater reservoirs is beneath ice streams, which are these fast flowing regions that we know feed ice from the continental interior to Antarctica's exterior to the oceans. And one of the reasons we want to look beneath ice streams is because sedimentary basins are a prerequisite for the formation of these ice streams. So here I've just made a little schematic showing our fast flowing ice over a sedimentary basin, which could contain groundwater. And we also have these subglacial lakes, active subglacial lakes that typically occur in sedimentary basins. And the region I'll be talking about today is the Willand's ice plain, which is about right here at the top of the Ross Ice Shelf. So how can we actually image this deep subglacial groundwater? Here I've pointed out that these sedimentary basins can be 100 meters to up to 10 kilometers thick. So we really need some sort of instrument that can sense these really deep sorts of structures. And electromagnetic methods are a good method to sense not only water, but water that exists very deeply. So here I'm showing electrical resistivity, which is primarily what electromagnetic methods are sensitive to. And here we just have resistivity on the bottom x-axis and conductivity, which is just the reciprocal on the top x-axis. And we can see that for a variety of earth materials, electrical resistivity spans several orders of magnitude. So this is really good from a sensitivity standpoint. And particularly for water, we're spanning about 3 orders of magnitude. And this varies as a function of ion concentrations. So salty water is going to be more conductive and fresher water will be more resistive. So this is something we should be able to sense. In particular, today, I'll talk about an electromagnetic method called magnetotellurics, or MT. This is a passive method that basically uses naturally occurring source fields that penetrate through the ice and the underlying geology and generate secondary currents in the subsurface based on the resistivity variations. So we can measure those electromagnetic fields with a receiver that we deploy in the snow, and then sort of back calculate to get resistivity and create a 2D model. So these are our steps: measure the fields, process those fields, invert for our resistivity model, and then interpret our resistivity model in terms of an earth property we're interested in. And so for those unfamiliar with magnetotellurics, this is our general footprint in the field. We have our data logger hub in the middle, and then from there we spread out and bury magnetometers and electrodes in the snow. And here's just a time lapse of us deploying a station. For the sake of time, I'll move forward. So like I mentioned before, we collected data in a fast flowing region called the Whillans Ice Plain. And the Whillans Ice Plain is underlain by active subglacial lakes, which is why I mentioned those before. So we went and collected magnetotelluric data at a subglacial lake, Whillans Subglacial Lake, or SLW, and also where we think this lake drains beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. And today I'll just talk about our results from Whillans Subglacial Lake. I am just going to hop right to our results. So this is the grid of empty stations that we collected with these yellow triangles over the lake. And this is an inversion result from the stations that I've circled here. So here we're looking at about 5 kilometers beneath the ice surface, and we're spanning 15 kilometers in the X direction. And the colors here are log 10 resistivity. So this yellow region is more resistive and the blue regions are more conductive. And you can see I've divided these into 3 different sections where we have our conductive regions, which are representative of water saturated sediments. And C2 is actually so conductive that it has to be salty groundwater. And I'll show you why in just a moment. And then R1 we think is low porosity bedrock down here. So our sediments are about 1.4 kilometers thick on the upstream side of the lake, and they get thinner as we cross the ice-sat lake boundary in the downstream direction. So now I'm just going to take the top portion that contain the sediments and convert them to groundwater salinity. And to do that, I use Archie's law, which basically relates bulk resistivity, which is this image we have here, to fluid resistivity or salinity, which is what we're interested, and porosity and a cementation exponent. Now, because we don't have any deep subglacial drilling holes, I use a porosity model based on the recent drilling in the Ross Sea. And then I'll show a few different salinity models for 3 different of these exponents. So now this is again just looking at this top sediment portion beneath the lake, and now our colors represent salinity here, where lighter colors are fresher water and purple colors are very salty water. And the seawater salinity contour is noted in red and the saline contour is noted in black. And these are 3 different models based on different exponents in our Archie's law. And I'd just like to point out that a lot of us are familiar with the Wizard project, where they did drill into the lake and then about 40 centimeters into the sediments. And it was predicted that there was some deeper solute source beneath Lake Whillans. And that is what we're seeing in all of these salinity profiles. So if we look at all of our data beneath Lake Whillans, we can see that this salty groundwater is extensive beneath the entire lake and then beyond the lake bounds. And I'll just kind of end with this conceptual model of Lake Whillans. And I would like to say this is based on previous geophysical surveying as well as our MT data. Our MT data is really looking at this deeper structure where we have a lake and it is situated above a thick package of sediments, and these sediments get saltier with depth. And just for reference, if we did a volume estimate just beneath the lake, we get about 40 times the amount of water that's actually contained in the lake that's in the groundwater. And this is where I'll actually end. We are seeing that groundwater does extend deeper than the till layer. And now kind of the next question is, what is the role of this groundwater for a variety of different important subglacial processes? And my 8 minutes are up, so I will leave it there.
Thanks, Chloe. That was great. For the sake of time, we'll keep the questions going in the chat, but move on to our next talk by Felipe.
Hi, everyone. Okay, sorry. Right. Hi, my name is Felipe Napoleoni. I'm a PhD student at Durham University. And today I'm going to talk about glacial lakes and hydrology across Ellsworth Glacial Highland. This is part of my PhD, and it's also part of a paper we submit to the cryosphere. The aim of this work is to identify subglacial lakes and the subglacial water flow routing. We think this is important because subglacial water has the potential to control the location of the ice sheet onset, but under different ice sheet extents, we might expect variations in subglacial water routing. In the figure, the white polygon is showing the Ellsworth subglacial highlands, and the black lines are representing the ice catchment. Although the most recent inventory accounts for around 400 subglacial lakes, very few subglacial lakes were detected in this region and only 2 subglacial lakes within the Ellsworth subglacial highland, Ellsworth and Sex. And so our work hopes to fill this regional gap and to contribute with new insights on the subglacial hydrological network. Sorry. So we use available airborne radar data from BBAS, represented in this figure by the white lines, to explore the ice bed interface by analyzing the bed reflection power. We first identified bright reflectors as potential candidates and analyzed the power of the reflector energy from the ice bed interface of this candidate. And then we correct the ice attenuation of the radar power to obtain the absolute reflection. And finally, we classify each successful lake candidate according to the degree of confidence we have following the approach of Carter and colleagues in 2007. So we also create a new DEM by integrating the radar data used in BedMap2 with the LORES and SEX radar surveys. And in this figure, as you can see, the blue lines are representing the BedMap2 radar lines, the red lines, the SEX survey, and the yellow one, the LORES survey. We then calculate the hydro potential, and because the subglacial water moves following the hydraulic potential gradient, we can determine the present day large scale subglacial flow routing and identify whether the candidate subglacial lakes connect into the subglacial hydrological network. This is a comparison between the different subglacial DEMs. The panel A is showing our work, B, it's showing BedMap2, and C, BedMachine Antarctica version 1. The key feature here is the newly identified deep trough that reaches from the interior of Ellsworth subglacial highland next to the Heritage Range and feds toward the Radford ice stream. This trough lies parallel to Ellsworth trough, which is also better resolved than in previous DEMs, and is up to 1,500 meters deep. We believe that this new trough is likely to be tectonically influenced due to its linear nature. And we also believe that these two troughs represent a potential connection between the Weddell Sea and the Munson Sea. This is an example of a definite subglacial lake. In panel A, the white lines are representing the airborne radar lines that we use for this example. In B, the radargram is showing in red the bed topography. X to X prime represent the surface of subglacial lakes Ellsworth. And this X to X prime is highlighted in this red box on the graphs. So we can see in the bed reflection power that we have a high peak above the subglacial lake Ellsworth. The specularity also is suggesting low specularity just in the middle of the subglacial lake. Also, the hydraulic potential is showing a very flat surface above the subglacial water. And finally, in F, we're seeing just the ice surface and the bed surface topography elevation profiles. So we classify each of these candidates and we find 7 definite subglacial lakes, 5 dim subglacial lakes, 20 fuzzy, and 1 indistinct subglacial lakes. And most of these subglacial lakes, almost every subglacial lake, is distributed in a highland, in the high relief of the core of Ellsworth subglacial highland. But there are some other subglacial lakes also in deep basins in the head of Radford Ice Stream, in high relief areas of Pine Island Glacier, and in the head of Thwaite Glacier. So this is the subglacial drainage, and basically the red lines are showing the flow routing toward Amundsen Sea, and the yellow lines are showing the flowing toward Weddell Sea. And as we can see in the figure, most of the subglacial lakes are draining toward the Amundsen Sea, crossing the ice catchment of Pine Island Glacier and Thwaite Glacier, Radford Ice Stream, Pine Island Glacier, and Thwaite Glacier. And in the detail, we can also see that some of the lakes could be connected along trunk stream that lies in the floor of the Ellsworth subglacial highlands. Also, we noticed that the ice divide, it's very close to many of these subglacial lakes, suggesting that the lake drainage could also switch toward the Institute-Moller system if the ice divide were to move in the past. But the key point we therefore want to highlight is that the subglacial water flow and the ice flow above these do not necessarily align under modern ice geometries, as you can see from the figure. And this might have implications to understanding the Thwaite Glacier ice flow. So now we are using radar data to understand the glaciology of the region, the reflection horizon and calculating their age. And also we're investigating the layer distortions as a function of past ice flow changes. All of these will be used to help inform the planned direct access of subglacial Lake 6 in the coming year. And also we will provide this information to anti-architectural action groups. And just to summarize, just to say that we use radar data to map and classify 33 new subglacial lakes, that many of these lakes sits within the highest relief core of Ellsworth subglacial highland and would, under current conditions, drain toward Thwaite Glacier. The new DEM of the region highlights the presence of a deep trough and rugged topography in Ellsworth subglacial highland. And finally, to point out that different ice geometries, such as might have been present in the past, might cause drainage to switch toward Weddell Sea via Institute ice stream. And that's it. Thank you very much. Yep.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Tim Campbell.
Slideshow, go from start. Thumbs up if this looks good to people, I think. Or if I don't hear anything, I will assume it's good. Sweet, well, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in. My name is Tim Campbell and I'm a PhD student at Montana State University, where I work in Dr. Mark Skidmore's geomicrobiology lab and also a member of the Salsa science team studying Mercer Subglacial Lake, or SLM. Today, I'm going to be presenting preliminary results on behalf of these co-authors on the basal ice stratigraphy observed in images captured from Mercer Subglacial Lake, and briefly discuss sub-ice stream accretionary processes interpreted from the sequence. The background here shows the ice-water interface just above the subglacial lake. And as you can see, there's abundant sediment contained in the ice, and we can use this to infer past basal conditions. So what can we learn about the West Antarctic ice sheet by looking at the basal stratigraphy? Assessing WAIS's vulnerability and predicting its fate remains difficult, but the basal ice layer provides insight into a few areas that's currently limiting our predictions. Broadly, modeling has outpaced understanding based on the direct observation of basal conditions. Since the basal ice properties reflect the conditions in which they formed, we can use these characteristics to constrain local processes that range on different temporal scales. The uncertain behavior of ice streams also leads to uncertainty in predicting mass balance changes, this being the active versus inactive cyclicity. This behavior history or periods of ice stream stagnation may be recorded in the basal ice record as well. Despite basal ice sequences serving as useful tools in constraining past and present subice processes, we have limited data from the interior of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and especially from dynamic ice stream settings. We rely heavily on the observations made beneath the Cam ice stream a few years back. So what did we do? During the 2018-19 field season, we used a hot water drill to melt about 1,100 meters deep into the Mercer ice stream. Our borehole was about 1092 meters deep. This is directly above Mercer Subglacial Lake. The clump weight of the deep, skinny ROV was deployed down the borehole during field operations, and it was equipped with a camera. As the camera was deployed down the borehole, it captured images of the borehole wall and included thousands of images of the basal ice sequence, which this turns out to be important because no basal ice samples were collected while we were in the field. So these images are our best opportunity of studying the basal ice and characterizing its properties. So for our image analysis, we first started off with sequentially characterizing the basal ice qualitatively via visual inspection of the images. We identified the boundary between glacial and meteoric ice underlying the accreted, or the transition between the meteoric and underlying basal ice by the transition from ice containing bubbles and hard to kind of, there's very little transparency to a bubble-free or transparent clear ice that is the basal ice layer, and it also contained sediment. So that transition is what we used. The sediment load contained within the basal ice was estimated by converting images to binary images based on brightness thresholds and previously published methods. Each pixel was replaced with a value 1 or a white pixel if the brightness was greater than the designated threshold, and then all pixels lower than the threshold was given a 0 value. In this case, sediment was represented by white values or 1s, and then the black or the basal ice by black or 0. And then by comparing the sediment area or pixels to total area of each image, we were able to estimate the sediment content sequentially. And then this picture here with the bird is kind of an example of how we could create or take a colored RGB formatted image and convert it to a binary, and then calculate the sediment content as a volume %. So our initial analysis of the images identified a 5.7 meter thick sequence of accreted basal ice at Mercer Subglacial Lake underlying the meteoric glacial ice. The results of the brightness distribution analysis shown here revealed variations in the abundance of sediment with depth. The basal ice sequence is comprised of 2 main facies. First, we have the basal dispersed, which is characterized by clear basal ice with almost no sediment to dispersed sediment. And these estimates ranged between 1% and 4% roughly. The second facies is a basal massive, which is a massive facies with stratified to solid frozen sediment containing pore ice. And then estimates on the sediment content for this unit ranged from about 10 to 20%. The 2 facies can be broken down to 4 subunits that are labeled here in this stratigraphic log. Starting at the ice-water interface, we have a massive and solid unit grading into a dispersed facies, which then grades back into the massive unit, but thinner than the first or the lower unit. And then this grades into a much thicker unit of dispersed facies up core. These results are similar to those reported by Gustafson et al. 2006 and 2010 from beneath the CAM ice stream, where they observed a 10 to 15 meter thick accreted basal ice layer. Although it is important to note that our layer is much thinner than theirs at this time. As shown in the basal ice sequence, the upper 4 meters of the basal ice layer is comprised of clear ice with dispersed sediment containing about 1% sediment and then 4% in the lower sequence. On the right, you can see the results of the binarization of our original borehole image and then the binary image below it. The image was taken from 1088.64 meters below surface and is broadly representative of the clear and dispersed facies and contained about 1% sediment. Following the model results from Gustafson et al. 2006 and 10, we predict that this facies formed during periods when the ice base was freezing while the hydrologic system was active, meaning that there was an abundant supply of subglacial meltwater separating the ice bed from the substrate. The dispersed sediment formed from clotting of fine-grained particles in suspension and transport. Then for the massive facies, which is our second main facies, we observed what contained about 13% sediment in the upper sequence and then more sediment at about 21% volume in the lower sequence. The image here on the right, again, the original image taken during borehole deployment of the clump weight, and then the binary image below it was taken at 1091.64 and is broadly representative of the massive facies for these 2 units. In contrast to the clear and dispersed facies that formed under conditions with abundant meltwater, this facies likely formed under conditions with high freezing rates with restricted water flow and volume. Depths with higher debris content, the solid facies indicate periods of very limited meltwater, which may be potentially representative of stagnant phases of the ice stream. The next step in this analysis is to further delineate the solid from massive units. So to summarize, we observed a 5.7 meter basal ice sequence above the ice-water interface at SLM that was contained abundant sediment at times. The sequence was composed of 2 main facies that was differentiated by that sediment content. And then the facies variations likely reflect changes in accretionary basal conditions, the availability of subglacial meltwater, and then previous periods of ice stream stagnation possibly. And this work couldn't have been done without the help of our entire science team, as well as our awesome group of drillers, and then also financial support from the NSF. So, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Pay attention to the chat because I'm sure you'll get some questions over there. Next up, we have Dougal Hansen telling us about subglacial sediment flux.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dougal Hansen, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'm going to be sharing some experimental results regarding controls on subglacial sediment flux. Now, understanding the basal boundary condition is a critical component of answering the question, how much, how fast? And this, of course, relates to how frictional resistance of the bed influences glacial motion. But another important aspect to consider is how sediment that is mobilized during glacier slip is transported and deposited. One area where this is particularly relevant is estimating rates of aggradation at grounding lines. It's clear that ice streams can build these grounding zone wedges at their terminal extent, and they're hypothesized to be potentially stabilizing factors in the face of climate force retreat. However, their functionality in this regard is directly related to basically the rate at which sediment can be moved out of the system and deposited on their flanks. So an accurate estimate of sediment flux is likely necessary to achieve a good prediction of long-term waste behavior. Shown on the plot here in seismic profile is a grounding zone wedge that Bart et al. Analyzed, and they're able to provide really interesting temporal constraints. However, this analysis, while really interesting, is difficult to obtain the data and cannot be applied in all regions. So given that a mechanistic understanding of these processes involved is highly desirable. So subglacial sediment flux in the south bed of glacier is primarily partitioned between debris entrained in basal ice and then sediment in transit through a till bed, which will be the focus of this talk. Till flux is going to be a function of the depth of deformation and the vertical distribution of horizontal velocities. And this depth terrain has been shown to range from centimeter scale to meters, but there's not a clear consensus on sort of what sets the depth for a given set of environmental parameters. A number of controls have been hypothesized to set the morphology of the profile. For brevity's sake, I'll be focusing on two in this talk, effective stress and basal ice velocity. And while these mechanisms are likely viable, there's been little work done to systematically assess the relative influence on strain distribution and till. So given this uncertainty, it sets up the following research question, which we will try to address. So how do sliding velocity and effective stress influence the distribution of strain at a subglacial till? To address this, we're going to utilize a new wind shear device that's designed to simulate glacier sliding in the laboratory. And essentially how this works is it presses a donut of temperate ice into a bed made out of subglacial till under a normal load. The temperature is controlled by a glycol water bath, and then it rotates at realistic velocities. We monitor the deformation in the till through cameras mounted against clear acrylic walls, and then shear stress and pore water pressure are monitored continuously throughout the experiment. So to give you an example, this is a quick video sped up about 3,000 times, but it's showing, as you can see, ice sliding over till, and shear at this stage in the experiment is concentrated in a narrow zone near the ice bed contact. So to quantify deformation, we use a technique called digital image correlation, which essentially is able to compute displacement between an image pair with an algorithm that splits up an image into predefined windows and then searches the second image for the zone of like maximum correlation. And from this, we can calculate an average median horizontal velocity profile, which is essentially taking the time series of images that you're interested in over some period, taking the median at each data point, and then averaging it with depth. And what we see in a lot of the experiments is sort of this curve is partitioned into two zones. There's a zone or a plug of sediment that moves at a relatively constant velocity at some fraction of the sliding velocity, under which is a monotonically decreasing shear zone. So in the next few slides, I'm going to be focusing on the shear zone, and then I'll move to my understanding of the plug. So in order to estimate or analyze the effective stress on sediment flux, we recorded the deformation at a number of stress states at a single sliding velocity. On the plot shown here, the y-axis is depth from the top of the shear zone, and then the x-axis is the normalized median horizontal velocity. And we normalize this because even though the sliding velocity is constant, the maximum velocity in the till is different between the different stress states, which is basically indicating that the degree of coupling is changing between the different experiments. So general observations here is that the shear or strain is localized in an area between 1 and 3 centimeters, and strain localizes as effective stress increases. Integrating these curves, we can obtain a relationship between the effective stress and then a normalized sediment flux. And what we see here is that there's a rapid increase in sediment flux from flotation to a maximum in our experiment around 16 kilopascals, then tapers off with increasing effective stress. Similarly, we can analyze the control of basal ice velocity on sediment flux. And to do this, we went through 3 velocity steps at a single effective stress, 35 kilopascals. And each of these curves represents an hour's worth of data, an hour's worth of images collected at 1-minute intervals, directly before the velocity step and then directly after the system reached steady state. Integrating these curves, we obtain a relationship for basal ice velocity and sediment flux. And what we see here is that there is a clear linear relationship between the two parameters. It's worth noting that the slope of this line is likely dependent on the grain size distribution and the stress state. So more work will have to be done there. Finally, asking what sets the thickness of this plug, we don't have as direct ability to quantify this. So this interpretation is a bit more qualitative. But we turn to evidence as shown here, where this thickness of this plug appears to correspond to the amplitude of an ice keel. Shown in the pictures is basically a time series of 3 images captured over a 30-hour interval. And in these, you see that the ice bed contact drops down in the camera's field of view by about 19 millimeters and then climbs back up. This deformation profile shown on the right was recorded about 50 to 59 hours after this ice keel had passed. And you see that the amplitude of the plug, or the depth of the plug, corresponds exactly with the depth of the this, what we call an ice keel. So this sort of sets up a conceptual model based on our experimental results, where you have ice moving at some velocity, and irregularities in the ice are basically setting this plug. So sediment flux is going to be in the till bed is going to be partitioned between this plug region and the shear zone region, and the velocity in the plug region is going to be a function of the sliding velocity, the degree of coupling, and then the amplitude of these irregularities at the ice bed interface. Sediment flux in the shear zone below it is going to be a function of the effective stress, the maximum velocity, and the plug overlying it, and then also grain size distribution, although I didn't present those results in this talk. So with that, I guess these are a summary of my experimental results, and I'll end it for questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We have time for about 1 question before we move on to our next speaker. There is a question in the chat from Christian, if you want to ask it out loud.
Yeah, I was curious if you tried this experiment with time-dependent effective pressures. So Slavic Tulichik came up with pore pressure diffusion as a potential explanation for distributed shear.
Right, yeah, that's so we an upcoming experiment that we are going to do is we actually have a new loading system that allows us to do cyclic loading, sort of like so on sinusoidal temporal scale. So that'll be a question that we will be reaching in the near future.
Great, thanks.
Okay. It is time for our last talk of the session before our discussion. So Christian, you can go ahead and share your screen.
All right, sorry, I was muted. Shout if you can't see what looks like a title page. I'm standing in for Lisa, but everything that I say that is wrong is my fault. So my interest here comes from a modeling perspective, trying to explain the formation of ice streams, and in particular, trying to address how they can be formed spontaneously. The modeling perspective nowadays is largely that we care about short timescales dictated by the IPCC, and we use inversions to say something about basal conditions, and that predicates where sliding happens, where fast flow happens. Of course, over longer time periods, you're actually interested in how the ice sheet determines by itself where fast sliding should occur. There are feedbacks that should dictate that. I'm particularly interested in not so much deep basins such as the Lamont Glacier, where this comes about through topographic control, but areas like the West Antarctic ice sheet, where ice streams are more likely to form in a way that's unconstrained by topography. And so I'm particularly interested in these upstream regions where you see fast sliding starting to emerge. And I've got a whole bunch of pictures here that are uncredited, so apologies to Ian Jochen and Eric Wigner and others here. So why is this an issue? This is a somewhat dated model into comparison. It shows a bunch of different models running through the same experiment, and this is basal velocity in a circular ice sheet. It almost doesn't matter what is being shown. These pictures, if the models agree, should all look the same, and they don't. And so this has been sort of a long-standing issue in ice sheet modeling. To get around to why there is an issue here, we have to talk about how sliding first starts in an ice sheet, and then that in a spatial sense. So the often used historically assumption is that sliding starts where the bed goes temperate. So if you're below the melting point at the base, you don't slide, and then you switch on sliding where you get temperate. And there's a few people who've over time recognized that this is a bad idea. If I were to zoom into this point here, where you go from no sliding to sliding, and I locally solve for what the velocity field looks like, I get something that looks like this. Now, that may be confusing. I go from left to right. Left is no sliding, right is sliding, and the faint gray lines in here are streamlines, essentially trajectories followed by individual pieces of ice. And so as you switch on sliding at the origin of this local coordinate system, what you do is you accelerate the ice to the right of here, but because ice is incompressible, it means that you have to pull down ice from higher up in the column. And what that does is it pulls colder ice closer to the bed. It increases your temperature gradient near the bed, and it should essentially instantly freeze the bed. So there is a fundamental modeling issue with this. That issue has nothing to do, incidentally, with whether you have higher order stress representations, as modelers tend to get excited about, or not. The solution you see here is computed with what modelers call a full Stokes model. It's simply an artifact of switching on sliding abruptly. So this doesn't work. What may work is a somewhat different approach, where you say that sliding starts continuously at temperatures below the melting point. That may work. You have to do it right. There are some ice sheet models out there that recognize the problem with abrupt switching on of sliding, but they do some stuff that numerically fixes the problem without necessarily fixing the physics. So here's an example of a calculation that does switch on sliding below the melting point. And you have an extensive, so I don't want to go into the details of the picture. This is isorines of horizontal velocity here. And you see that horizontal velocities are quite low to the left near the ice divide, where the ice is cold bedded. And then you have an extensive zone shown in gray, where you have sliding just below the melting point, and velocities start to increase until you reach fully tempered sliding on the right. So one of the things we're interested in is whether this picture fixes the sliding onset is stable. Is this an ice sheet that will persist? We knew in 2 dimensions this is unstable in time. We were interested in whether in 3 dimensions something interesting happens. So the next picture you'll see here is confusing. You're looking down at the ice sheet, and in particular looking down at the ice sheet bed. And there are 2 calculations, one left-hand column, one right-hand column. In the left, basal velocity is shown in colors and in contour lines, with the flow going from left to right. So the relatively slow velocities here increasing to the right, and you see this pattern occur, form here spontaneously. The pink line is the transition from below the melting point to above the melting point. And so you're seeing essentially an ice stream form spontaneously here with a slow flowing ice ridge in between. The gray lines are, again, streamlines, trajectories that ice would take. The bottom panel shows bed temperature in the sort of light to dark blue transition. So here you're close to the melting point, here you're at the melting point, and here in the ice ridge is the temperature actually goes really low. So this, the model used here is something of a novelty. For those of you into ice sheet modeling, it's shallow in the along flow x direction. It fully resolves ice thickness scale processes in the transverse direction. So it's essentially a semi-full Stokes model. So we see this spontaneous formation of a pattern out of essentially stochastic noise in the properties of the bed. That onset doesn't have to happen in the temperate ice, sorry, the subtemperate sliding region here though. You can have an alternative scenario where you start with some limited subtemperate sliding, the bed goes temperate, and then you have pattern formation as a result of a related but not identical instability in subglacial water flow. And so this is an example here where you see no pattern over to the left. The ice flow reaches the melting point first pink line here, and then over here, you start forming a pattern and a margin with cold temperatures at the bed reforms. All right, this model being fancy, it tells us a lot about processes that happen in cross-section of the ice stream. I don't want to get into this. Like I said, it's a full Stokes emulation in the transverse plane. So we get the full dynamics of the margin. And one of the things it does for us, it actually allows us to say something pretty concrete about the widening of the ice stream as you go downstream. All right. Something else I should say here is that, so these solutions are actually unique steady state solutions given a certain amount of noisiness in the properties of the bed. We can also show that they're highly likely to be unstable in time. They don't want to persist. And so these ice streams are likely to actually want to evolve into a switch on, switch off kind of cycle. That's going to be future work. But it's quite relevant to understanding what ice sheet modeling may need to actually do in terms of time and spatial scales that need to resolve. I'm on the clock here, but you could ask, has this been done before? And there are two relevant examples. This is a paper by Richard Hindmarsh, about 10 years old, where he, through a forward integration of an ice sheet model, obtains a stable set of patterns. So the ice streams here are these red regions of temperate bed. And these are stable. These are not oscillatory in time. The difference between his stuff and what we were doing is really that in his model, subtemperate sliding happens at very, very low temperatures. And so that turns out we can also show that that's the case, tends to stabilize this pattern in time. But if you decide that your ice sheet model needs to be stable in time, and therefore you pick your sliding parameters such that you suppress temporal instabilities, you're making some fairly strong assumptions about how the ice sheet works. The case where ice streams form due to an instability in water flow at the bed is also not entirely new. This is due to Teresa Kirk-Smith and others a few years ago, who computed these patterns. The difference with our work here is that for technical reasons, they're unable to solve fully for the temperature of the bed. And so you have these fast flowing ice streams and these ice ridges in between, but they're not able to let the bed freeze in here. And so one of the things that's quite different from our model is that the ice stream actually narrows as you go downstream, as opposed to in our case widening again. So in terms of the lessons for ice sheet modeling is that the models we have currently are unable to fully capture all of this stuff, mostly due to things that we can't resolve yet. And we should be a little bit careful about building models that produce results that look good because we want them to be so. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Christian. So this is the beginning of our discussion period, and there has been a lot of buzz going on in the chat about Chloe's subglacial groundwater. So Chloe, do you want to fill everyone in about some of the questions you've been answering?
Sure. Let me look at the questions. So TJ asked about the origin of the saltwater, which is certainly a really interesting question that I didn't really have time to touch on today, but some of the options for emplacing salty groundwater just in general in sedimentary basins are marine incursions, so seawater coming in and filling up the sediments, cryoconcentration, so when we have ice freezing and preferentially pulling up the fresher water and leaving saltier bits behind. And then in other regions, you might have buried evaporites, so these salt deposits that groundwater interacts with and dissolves over time. But I think the most likely scenario for Lake Whillans is a marine incursion. And For anyone who hasn't actually seen Ryan's paper that came out this year, she has a nice radiocarbon paper about how Lake Whillans was inundated with seawater in like the mid-Holocene. So I think that's like even more evidence that a marine incursion in this region is likely. Another question, Rebecca had a few questions just about kind of groundwater in general, asking, does it need to be a certain depth, e.g. a water saturated sediment of 400 meters depth? We don't really define a depth. We don't have a depth constraint on groundwater. We're just basically saying our more conductive regions are likely to represent sediments with groundwater. And she also brought up meltwater, and meltwater could certainly be, meltwater could be emplaced in these sediments. That's definitely an option. But there is always a slight salty component. So eventually something changes with depth where we get saltier water. But the meltwater component could certainly be contributing to the overall groundwater situation.
I have a logistical question. So we've been poking holes all over the Cycle Coast for a few decades now, and we've accessed 2 subglacial lakes, and we've been able to collect short cores. How far away do you think we are from drilling deep enough to get a sample of this subglacial groundwater?
Oof. Others who are more familiar with drilling logistics, please feel free to chime in. I'll just say something real quick, that having one of these deep subglacial drill cores would be like, it'd be incredible, because then we'd have so many more constraints on like these resistivity images, but also like other geophysics. And then we could really start to say something about groundwater flow, because we could really constrain that Archie's law that we're using. We can look at the permeability of the sediments and maybe even get some sort of constraint on flow. But I'll let others chime in for the actual feasibility of that happening soon.
Yeah, I think about timescales. So a sample of that would be really nice to get a good idea of timescales. I see that Brent can chime in about drilling, so I'll let him do that.
Yeah, you know, I'm not exactly sure who's on here, but as a representative for the ice drilling program science advisory panel, make sure you're looking at the exact words are eluding me right now, but look at the future projections and demands from us scientists on the engineers in the ice drilling program, and you know, be an active participant in that, because we really do drive the technology development for these programs. And I know Paul Cutler is on the line, and he would probably echo that in terms of driving where IDP takes their engineering resources.
I know there are several of us early career folks on the call who would like to help with that driving. Are there ways in place that we can get involved?
Yeah, you're always welcome to contact the panel. Any one of us, or all of our names are on the website, and we, you know, we'll pass that along. And there are white papers, and there are every couple of years there are planning meetings for the science community to take part in and write these white papers.
Great, thanks, Brent. I see that there is a question for Christian in the chat about the width of ice streams in your modeling.
Yeah, sorry, trying to find the microphone button here. So the question is, what sets the width of the ice streams in our model? I was just typing out an answer. It gets slightly complicated to explain this. The price we pay for having a model that fully resolves ice thickness in the lateral direction is that we are limited in essentially the width of the domain that we can faithfully say something about. And as a result, we tend to get a single ice stream per domain width. The domain is periodic in our case. If you wanted to figure out how you do wavelength selection in this model, you'd need to go to larger wavelengths, and then it gets very difficult to combine that with the local physics without going to essentially a fully configured, full Stokes, as people call it, ice sheet model that would take a very, very long amount of time to run to produce these patterns. That's a somewhat unsatisfactory answer, but essentially at the scales you're working at, you're going to get one ice stream per domain width. And that's, it's a drawback I can explain in detail technically, but to overcome that, yeah, you have to do something that is much more expensive.
Can I ask a question to Dougal? So Dougal, so those ice fields, so they just happen to form. You didn't intentionally form them.
Well, I think that, so the width of these things varied a lot between the two experiments, and the greatest ice keel, which is the one I was showing, I think corresponded to just the way I built it in that first run. I think the ice bed interface was just slightly off kilter, so it sort of created this this sort of irregularity that developed as it spun. In the second experiment, the ice bed interface was more planar, and the irregularities developed, but only on the order of like half a centimeter to a centimeter.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. Right, so as one of the conveners, I was just combing through the chat box to see if we had not followed up on any questions, but it doesn't seem that way. Maybe something to think about here. I'm very much an observational person, and we had a mix of observations, lab experiments, and modeling, and perhaps there might be some disconnect between those three things. So maybe I can ask Christian to comment about some of the things that we heard today on the observations. And really what it comes down to, I think, is, you know, what other observations are needed, or do you not want any more observations from the modeler's perspective?
Okay, well, I'm a really bad modeler to ask, because I try to model physics. I don't try to model or predict sea level rise, and so there's a big difference there. I am very interested in all of this observational stuff, because I can develop, people like me can develop models that target, sort of specific models that target particular physics. If you are running a big ice sheet model, you're kind of limited by all sorts of stuff, computing power, the architecture of your big model, etc. And there is, like, I only joined the discussion very late yesterday, but there was talk about that at the end of the ice shelf session, and essentially crystallized down to the data, in a sense, is way ahead of what models can currently deal with in terms of physics. And what I would have said if I chosen to speak up, then would have been met. Other fields do things that go under the name of dynamic downscaling. You have a coarse model that runs at the scales you can afford to globally, if you like, and then you do nested models that try and capture local detail. And if we want to bridge the gap between current ice sheet modeling, sort of the IPCC perspective, and the kind of physics that we're really starting to see in observation stat is probably the bridge we need to build. That's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but I mean, I can envisage looking into all sorts of really cool stuff, but I think you're thinking about different modelers from me.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you, Christian. But what about things like, so Chloe's talking about is deep water. So are you saying we're actually too far away from incorporating that kind of information to use for to feed into the models? And like you just said, you might not be the exactly the right person to ask about the future projections, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, good point. So then you're talking about subglacial hydrology, and in a place like Antarctica, we are quite a long way from actually being able to answer some really first order questions about what the hydrology there looks like. We have a better idea in places like Greenland. Bed access is a bit easier there. So we have a greater sense that the hydrology of Greenland looks actually surprisingly like mountain glaciers. The problem in Antarctica is that the meltwater supply is orders of magnitude smaller. So we generally don't have a surface water supply. So we understand relatively little about how water moves around. We know it does. There are lakes that drain. But now you're asking the question of how much does the deep water matter? It's a question of what's the permeability of that deep basin. Does the water just sit there? And the fact that it's salty suggests that yes, a lot of it sits there because it was presumably incorporated in the sediments that were deposited in a submarine environment and hasn't been flushed out. If it is just sitting there and the hydrology is really happening close to the surface, then maybe it doesn't matter, but that's a very presumptuous thing to say. So I think we're limited in a lot of things because they're really basic questions about how you'd actually construct the right model that we have answers to. And you know, hydrology, it's extremely expensive to drill holes. So it's great to see that you know, remote techniques are giving us a much better window into this, but we're still quite a long way from a robust model.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we touched on the deeper water, and we had a good discussion about the deeper water. But now you just said that maybe something closer to the surface. So I want to go back to Felipe's findings, and I was quite actually surprised to see that many more lakes were discovered. But you think that trend, Felipe, is going to actually keep going in terms of finding more potential subglacial lakes if we get more of this radar data?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, in the radar data set, we have seen some high bed reflection powers signals. So I think we might find more subglacial lakes in the future. And possibly if we have more radar data lines in the region, I think we might find more subglacial lakes as well.
Is there actually a specific way that radar data need to be collected so that you can find more subglacial lakes?
Well, I think the better way, I would say, is try to avoid the topography somehow. Like, I mean, it doesn't work if we collect a radar line parallel to a deep trough. Probably the mountains or the topography are going to shadow the any potential subglacial lake. So I think it's important to know or to bear in mind the topography, subglacial topography, when the these radar designs are, you know, thinking. So Yeah.
Felipe, how big are your new lakes compared to the other lakes in the area? Do you have an idea of size constraint?
Yeah, well, we try in the paper. We tried to do a size constraint, but it was utterly rejected. Yeah, it's difficult to make an estimation of the size because we just have one line on each lake, so we have just one measurement on the lake. So we could do, you know, some minimal estimation of the length, but. Yeah, I wouldn't dare to say anything about an area or even a volume. So
Okay.
yeah, I think in the paper and in the annexed part, there is some more details about the subglacial lakes characteristics. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Chloe again. I'm going to talk some more. I just wanted to follow up on what Christian was saying, and I think it is a good point that because this water is salty, it might not necessarily be influencing the subglacial hydrology. And also sort of the larger point I would like to make is there's actually a lot of paleo groundwater studies that have been done in the Northern Hemisphere that explore the relationships between like the Laurentide ice sheet and groundwater systems. And it's kind of interesting because those modeling studies kind of are more focused on the groundwater flow and just kind of have like really, they have a changing ice sheet, but it's not like the kind of ice sheet models we have in Antarctica. So I think eventually there will be a cool way to sort of combine kind of the more complex ice sheet modeling that's been done in Antarctica and the more complex groundwater modeling that's been done for the Northern Hemisphere for like paleo ice sheets. And if anyone is interested in those studies, Mark Persone has a really nice 2012 review paper on that. And he does also mention some Antarctic studies as well, but they're just more focused on the till layer. But I agree with what Christian was saying is it seems like there's still kind of a ways to go before those two sort of different systems can be coupled in models or in one sort of all-encompassing model.
Okay, it seems like this conversation is winding down a bit, so we can go ahead and wrap up the discussion. I wanted to thank all of our speakers again for a great session and remind everyone to tune in for session 8.2, which is happening Tuesday the 29th from 9:30 to 10:30. So thanks everyone for showing up.